Now, this is a video I've been wanting to make since I left high school at the end of 2016. As many of my close friends know, and as if you couldn't tell by the title of the video, I'm an atheist. I've been an atheist since I was about 16 years old. I started calling myself an atheist around the age of 12, but that was more about the time I started moving away from Christianity. Now, I wanted to make this video as a retrospective, looking back on my time in school, sort of through an atheist lens, because I think I've got a few things that I think are worth saying. Now, my entire educational life was sort of overshadowed a bit with Christianity. I was always taught the word of the Bible, that Jesus died for my sins, and I was going to go to heaven when I die, etc., etc. And to be brief, it wasn't until about the age of 11, when I was in year 5, that I actually started thinking for myself, and I actually read the Bible by myself instead of having it read for me. And I remember the first part that I read that really stuck out in my mind was when Moses was coming down from the mountain and he had the 10 Commandments with him, and he saw that everyone was sinning and all that, and that God essentially just said, look, these are all sinners, you should kill them. And so about 3,000 Israelites? Levites? I can't remember. About 3,000 people died, is what I'm trying to say. Now, this wasn't the peaceful, loving and forgiving God that I'd been taught when I was growing up. And it was this that started the cracks in my perception of Christianity. And these cracks were only widened in the years to come as my interest in philosophy, especially morality, became much more of a focus in my life. Now, in this, I never looked down on Christians. I was all pretty mellow about it. I was 11 or 12 for pity's sake. And it never bothered me that they were teaching us to be Christians, because they never really forced it onto us. Most of the lessons surrounding Christianity were just telling the stories that were in the Bible, and that's all that really was. I mean, you can't make up all that much complex lessons when you've got like a bunch of 11-year-olds, really. And it was in this point in my life that I guess I developed my first virtue. And that it was they weren't forcing their ideas and beliefs on me, so I wouldn't force mine on them. They were nice people, and they were doing what they only thought would be best for us as kids, and I don't hold that against them. And I was 12 at this point, mind you. I'd never read any philosophy books, I never knew any big-name atheist people. I came to this conclusion completely on my own. Now, from this point, everything started to snowball downhill when I entered high school, and two things happened. One was that I was more emotionally crippled than before, and I don't want to get into that, that's an aside. But in another sense, the way they taught Christianity took a pretty sharp turn. It became more focused on bookwork, and it was taught in a way that was not interesting or engaging or thought-provoking in any way. I was more fascinated in religion in general at this point in my life, but the way they just taught it was just so boring. It always just felt like a one-sided conversation where you just listen to what the teacher says, but you don't really have that much of an input. People just didn't give two shits about the class because of how poorly engaging it was, especially for the young atheists in the room. And this is the crutch of what I really want to focus on in this video. Because for young atheists like myself, there was nothing interesting or thought-provoking in the class. And if there's nothing interesting to engage you with, then why pay attention? It was just bookwork, bookwork, bookwork. And it was so bloody monotonous that I was bored to tears, and it often just involved repeating the same things that the teacher said or read out, and you just write it down. It felt like we were being taught to be Christians instead of being taught about Christianity, and I think that's where everything really started to go wrong. Within the first 3 years, I was taught what felt like the same thing over and over again, in the same method over and over again, with all that bookwork over and over again, and it just made me feel frustrated. There were no specific instances that I can use to illustrate this. Honestly, I can barely remember a single thing between those lessons. It was more like a slow progression and swelling of frustration in my gut that I could never get rid of, like a cannonball of a tumour. That's what it felt like. Let me try and picture it for you. It was like going to a school teaching you about how great communism was. It told you about how it helps people and helps the world prosper, but in the meanwhile, you know that it's just a load of bunk. You know that communism doesn't work, but you never really had the courage to sort of ask questions because no one else was asking questions. No one else was engaged or interested in the lesson. Now obviously I'm not saying it was 1984, and I can understand how some would think I'm being hyperbolic about it, but that's what it felt like, to me at the very least. I just felt like I was being lied to, plain and simple, and I was being taught to be something that I knew I wasn't. So imagine that feeling for 3 consecutive years. That's what it felt like. I became arrogant and aggressive, and I viewed Christians as these one-dimensional people who don't care for constructive criticism, who don't care about conversation, and are just all brainwashed idiots. Needless to say, it wasn't healthy. It almost cut me off from a couple friendship, more than a couple friendships, all because of this just aggressive mentality that I had. The next year, however, flipped my perception and turned my world inside out and back to front. I had a teacher who still to this day is my absolute favourite teacher because of how he handled his lessons involving Christianity. Now obviously I can't say his name, so I'll call him something else. Call him Mr. Tax's Theft. No, fuck no, I think everyone knows who he is. Now, Mr. Tax's Theft, his lessons were incredibly different to how the lessons the 3 years prior had been. There was no more book work, which is a huge relief, and he tackled lessons with more of an open discussion to them. He was often asking us of our opinions and our perspectives of things. It felt more inclusive because he was actually talking with us and going through the lesson with us, not just talking at us. He was clearly a teacher that was passionate about his classes. He valued intellectual honesty and open discussion. Above all else, I felt comfortable. I was interested and engaged in his classes, and it was in a way that I never had before. He spoke in a way that was welcoming and open to people's opinions and ideas, and it was just fantastic. I loved it. I remember one of his first lessons that really caught my attention was one where he was talking about homosexuality. And he was talking about this gay guy who's Christian, but he's also happily married to a woman. He didn't even really touch that much on Christianity until like the last 10 or so minutes of the lesson, where he sort of gave a biblical perspective on the matter. And this was the sort of format that he'd do throughout the rest of the year. He'd give a very neutral and nuanced perspective on philosophy or a subject such as homosexuality, morality, mortality, freedom of speech, tax, but then he'd always just give a Christian perspective at the end of the lesson to sort of tie it all off with a neat bow. And very rarely did I ever feel that he was trying to convince us that his perspective was the best one. He'd always leave the lessons open-ended. You know, sort of like he wants us to come to our own conclusions and opinions on our own. Within the first month of his lessons, I felt that the pent-up cannonball of frustration that had been building up inside of me for the past 3 years just evaporate. I felt calm for the first time since I started high school, and I no longer viewed Christians as these dumbasses. I mean, I was an atheist, and my favourite lesson of the week was always Mr. Tax's Theft's Christianity class. I'd always, like, stay behind on lessons just to talk with him. I'd often ask questions and raise my hand in the class. Hell, I even got, like, awards at the end of the semester because of that class. Sometimes that was the only award I'd get. If you want a show of how engaged an atheist can be in a class about Christianity, then look no further. Now, I say all this because I understand with the school I went to, it's fair to say that they want everyone going there to end up being Christians. I know, what a revelation! But it's something I can completely understand. But I just think that they're not going about this in a really good way. And that ties back to what I said before about me just not being engaged or interested in any of the classes. Because at the end of the day, I'd speculate that you're going to have about 3 types of students in the class. The first type being the Christians that you're not going to have to do anything really to convince them that Jesus is there for them and to accept Jesus and all that. The second group being those who kind of just don't care, that you will just not really give a shit about the lesson, and if you ever ask them if they're a Christian, they'll just say yes to get out of the conversation. I feel like there's quite a few of those people. But the third type is, you guessed it, atheists. There's going to be atheists in the class, and frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if there's going to be a lot more in the years to come. The emotions I felt in my first 3 years of high school are what a lot of other young atheists are going to feel. Let me give you an example. Now, there was another atheist in my grade that I knew of. We'll call him My PC is Better Than Yours. Not as many people are going to get that But a month or 2 into my classes with Mr. Tax's Theft, I was heading back to my locker with this guy, and we were talking about Christianity and Christians in the school. To say the least, the conversation got pretty heated. He went on and on about how Christians don't have any evidence for their claims, how they don't care for discussion or constructive criticism, and above all else that they're just all brainwashed idiots. I swear, brainwashed. He'd always say brainwashed. He'd just say it so many times, like a mantra, over and over again. And I could see in his, not only his words, but in his expression, in his body language, in his tone of voice, that he was venting out a lot of frustration that he had. It was clear as day to me. And I realized that that's who I was only a few months prior to that. This is the caliber of many atheists that are going to grow up and enter into the real world with this sort of mentality. And if there's anything I know about psychology, it's that what you believe when you're young sticks with you for a long, long time into adulthood. Mindsets like this are going to burrow down like a tick and be a real bastard to dig out later in life. Every statistic I find shows religiosity on the decline, especially among young people. And many of them, I have no doubt, are going to grow up with this sort of mentality for one reason or another. And it's just not healthy. It's disregarding of other people's perspectives, and it's just incredibly close-minded. Conversation and honesty are the 2 things that got me out of that rut when I was an aggressive atheist. And if I didn't have the lessons I had with Mr. Tax's Theft, I would have gone out into the world and had the exact same mentality I had when I was in the first 3 years of high school. I would have been spiteful, I would have been close-minded and emotionally biased, to say the least. I would have perceived Christianity and Christians as just this blight on the earth. I wouldn't have constructively criticized it. I would have just emotionally walled all that off because of how I'd grown up. And when I think back to school, to my high school, of all the lessons that I will eventually forget in the years to come, all of them very good lessons, keep in mind, it was still a good school. Of all the lessons, I think Mr. Tax's Theft's lessons will be the last ones that I end up forgetting. And that's all I have to say on that.